Good day, everybody. This is Eric Wilson. I see we have a lot of attendees joining us as we speak, so I'm going to give a couple minutes while people are attending. I will give you a brief introduction of who we are and why we're here today, especially for those new to the Institute of Business Forecasting, the IBF. I wanted to share a little bit about us. First of all, my name is Eric Wilson. I'm the Director of Thought Leadership for the IBF, and will be the moderator for today's webinar or live cast. And we do encourage questions for today. So if you please, as you have a question, if you would like to ask the panel anything, there's a QA box located on the bottom right of the GoToMeeting platform. That's going to allow you to interact with us, to ask the panel or ask me some questions during it. Feel free to let them fly during the presentation. If we come up with a good question, I will go ahead and bring that to the panel as I get it. So don't wait to the end. If you have something, raise your hand and ask the question. A little bit about IBF. IBF's mission is to foster the growth of demand planning and forecasting and S&OP in the careers of those in the field. So basically, you, the audience. We're about promoting this industry and this field. We're recognized as a world leader as provider of demand planning and forecasting and analytics and S&OP education. We do benchmarking research, on-site corporate training, e-learning. We have a certification program and advisory and assessment services. We've actually been doing this now for well over 30 years now. I think Larry's been there for most of them. We have a recognized certification program. We have two different designations. We have a CPF, a Certified Professional Forecaster, and an ACPF, which is an advanced version of the CPF certification. And not only do we do this via certification and research, but through our global conferences, workshops, we have boot camps, academies, we have a blog. Our flagship publication is the Journal of Business Forecasting, otherwise known as the JBF. And we have a lot of resources available for our membership. So if you already haven't been involved with IBF, please check us out and see what we can do to help you in this field. So please contact us if you'd like more information, all the great things IBF does to support this field. You can find out more information at ibf.org. So we still have some people rolling in, but we're going to go ahead and jump into today's topic. We're going to be with you for the next 45 minutes to an hour to talk a little bit about unforeseen events. As much as change is certain, we will inevitably have major disruptions. I mean, first of all, though, I want to say our hearts do go out to everyone directly impacted by the recent hurricane, especially in Puerto Rico with what's happening with Maria right now, and also the earthquake that happened in Mexico as well. This does have a human element, and it cannot be forgotten. So we want to say the first our prayers and hearts go out to them. What we're going to be talking about today is the impacts of things like hurricanes and other natural disasters on business and really the consumers for those businesses. More specifically, what we really wanted to look at is through the lens of a demand planner and forecaster. We have a tough job of unforeseen circumstances, be able to plan for those circumstances before and after they happen. And with major disruptions, we need to be able to put together the right policies and procedures to be able to take care of it when they do occur. We got a fantastic panel to be able to talk about this. So looking at who's going to be speaking today from left to right, let's start with Andrew Snyder from Medtronic. Andrew is an award-winning sales and operations planning and supply chain management professional. He is also a board of advisors for the Institute of Business Forecasting and Planning and regularly international speaker at industry events. So they can put a voice to the name, Andrew. Go ahead and say something for us.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for dialing in.
Okay, next we have Mike Harsh from Johnson Controls. And just to let you know, he literally wasn't on the panel until about last night, about 6 or 7 o'clock. in the forecasting professional. As things happen in real time, we adapt, and we had unfortunately had a couple panelists drop out, and we had a couple new ones come. So that just shows planning in real time does work out. So we had Mike join us last night from Johnson Controls. We're very happy to have his expertise. Mike Harsh has an extensive experience in establishing and leading supply chain organizations on 4 continents, and in finding optimal network strategies and implementing the right organizational structure, business processes, and technical infrastructure. Mike has spoken at Gartner and SAP and Apex conferences on forecasting, planning, inventory optimization, and supply chain transformation. Mike, go ahead and say hello so they can hear your voice.
Thank you for having me, and looking forward to it.
Next, we have Larry Lapidi from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and MIT Research Affiliate. Larry has extensive business experience in industry consulting and research. He was a forecaster in the industry for many years, as well as a leading market analyst in the research of forecasting and supply chain. Larry, go ahead and say hello.
Hello, everybody. It's Larry Lapidi. Welcome to the webinar.
And finally, Patrick Bauer from COMB. Patrick has a wide array of expertise, including S&OP, demand planning, inventory, network optimization, and production scheduling. He is a recognized expert on demand planning and S&OP, and self-professed, and I would agree, S&OP geek. He was also a recent recipient of the IBF 2012 Most Coveted Award for Excellence in Business Forecasting and Planning. Patrick, how you doing?
I'm doing okay, and of course the circumstances would happen. Right outside my office there's a garbage truck making noise, so forgive me for that. But good morning, everyone.
Good morning to you. Good afternoon, depending on where you are. So that is our esteemed panel. I said I'm excited about getting into this topic, and with that, I think we're going to go ahead and dive right into this. And one of the things I mentioned, this is any kind of unforeseen event we really wanted to talk about today. This does not necessarily need to be just the recent hurricanes. I mean, I know when I first we talked about this topic and this topic came up, that week alone in the US, we had on the left coast was on fire. Pretty much the entire western of the United States was on fire. The south coast was underwater. The northeast coast had way below average temperatures, and the middle, nobody really lived. So the result was our POS data from that week was down everywhere. My job, I had to interpret what that meant and what it means going forward. That's really what we're talking about these unforeseen events. I mean, I know I'm not alone when I say that many companies get surprised by such events and have to go into a reaction mode. We're going to talk about planning ahead because I think it's important. But first, I do want to talk about when these events do occur, what do you do immediately when they occur and after occur? So I want to start off with Patrick. As far as when these type of events occur, do you replan or to go in type of a disaster recovery when events like this one occurs? I mean, how do you react?
Well, I think the very first thing you do is have to account for your people. So typically people that respond well essentially roll call their people and do a quick status update as to the facilities and everything else that's involved in whatever the disaster was. And once you get past sort of the people side of it, then you have to really start digging in, and it's like this giant status update. Where's my inventory? What was the last thing produced off the line? What's en route? What components and raw materials are inbound to a plant or a distribution facility? You have to sort of do a net assessment of where you are. And I'm not sure if anyone else experienced this, but I worked for a company for 7 years, and every year we did a disaster recovery day, and there were 7 global plants. And every year we'd plan for it, but we would never know the scenario until it actually happened. And all the plants, it was a global operation, so all plants were involved in this disaster recovery. And you know, one year it was a fire at a plant. Another year it was a tornado that hit a distribution center. Another year a screw on an extruder went out. And one of the things that I found in that exercise is the need for data and to be able to call and summon data. And I was having a conversation with someone about this recently, and part of my experience curve was the first year when they did this initially was we found that we only had about 20% of the total data. So after the disaster recovery drill, as it were, we went out and built all sorts of queries and hard-coded some reports to make sure that we have a lot of data at our fingertips. The subsequent year when we did it, we had probably 70 or 75% of the data needed. And again, we came out of the exercise saying, what data do we need? And again, this is some of what I already talked about. It was what's our demand? What items have a critical level of inventory? What are we shipping and where? What's the carriage involved? Do we have boats coming into an island, or do we have stuff on rail coming at us? What are the production plans that got waylaid? If it was a plant that got damaged, and really just going through this massive status update. And if people aren't doing that and aren't thinking about that, they should. So that you have essentially a disaster recovery set of data. So that was one of the key and most important learnings that every time I've been through this, either in real life as real practice or in these disaster recovery drills, data became the thing that we strive for most, at least once we got past the roll call of people.
You mentioned the disaster recovery drills. Does like a disaster recovery core team go into effect when these happen as well then?
Yeah, it was an all hands on full engagements, senior leadership down to supply planners, demand planners, marketing folks, and it's really an intriguing exercise if you do it, because you start looking at how it impacts your demand. What is this going to mean in terms of our volume? And all of us are trying to satisfy our consumers, whether we're a second tier or a third tier supplier, or whether we're a direct consumer goods company. We always want to be able to meet our demand. So it's kind of a long conversation and an important conversation about who your consumer is, who's buying your product, and how you'll be able to support them, and how it's going to affect them. And one of the examples I've used in the past is if you sell to the dollar stores, a lot of those people that buy at dollar stores are financially strapped. And if that's your key class of trade, and you have financially strapped people who are now, running for their lives, as it were, they're going to be cash strapped. So you're probably going to lose a bunch of volume. So you have to understand your consumer and the products that you sell and the class of trade you sell in. If you sell medical devices or you sell products that are OTC in nature, if someone has a cold or an infection, they're still going to go get whatever they have, whatever you have over the counter or prescription. They're still going to get that demand. They're still going to get that filled somewhere. But if you're selling Tasty Cake or Hostess, you're probably going to lose a bunch of that volume because that relies upon direct store delivery in the region in a moment of time. So there's a lot of, you have to really understand your consumer, and that's part of the conversation when you put together your core group of team. I think marketing and sales becomes a very key component. Everyone thinks it's an operations exercise, and it becomes this conversation about who you are demand-wise, who you sell to.
Okay. Larry, let me ask you then, because a lot of what you're talking about is business continuity team, whatever we want to call it. Your experience at MIT Center for Transportation Logistics, I mean, I'm sure you have some stories or insights on this one.
Okay. Yeah, as I was mentioning to you, Eric, first of all, when I was at MIT, Professor Yossi Sheffi, he is really the guy who coined the term resilient enterprise. And what he means by that, I'll give you the title of his book so you can for people on a webinar. They can get a copy of them if they're interested. Anyway, Yossi wrote the definitive book on it, The Resilient Enterprise, Overcoming Vulnerability for Competitive Advantage. In 2005, he wrote a follow-up to that with a lot of examples of what companies do for cases like this when you have a major disruption, major event happen, called The Power of Resilience, how the best companies manage the unexpected. So if people on the webinar want to kind of find out how some companies have handled these things, they can go to that. But there's a couple things that I did learn while Yossi was doing the research. I didn't do the research myself. One was the Katrina story. The Katrina story was one that, if you remember New Orleans, it was forecasted to happen. And Home Depot and Walmart became the heroes of Katrina because, unfortunately, FEMA response wasn't enough, right? They kind of blew it. The real heroes are Home Depot and Walmart, who took a lot of their goods and pre-deployed them, given that there was a forecast of a hurricane coming and the floods that might occur. Home Depot and Walmart deployed inventory before the hurricane hit in order for people to be able to take advantage of that. And they became actually the heroes of that particular thing. There's also the story about Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble had a Folgers plant down there at the time that actually went down. And I heard a presentation by the Procter & Gamble people about how they handled it. And I was actually amazed that the human response was the first response. And two things. One is, you have to first, so let's take that plant. You first quarantine that location, right? Which says nothing's coming in and out of that location. Don't expect that location to be around at all, or that plant to be around at all. So now, given that's the case, you got to reconfigure your network configuration to take it to kind of get your operations running on a continuous basis, assuming you're getting nothing further there. It's a mistake to think you're going to get anything out of that location until you get it back in shape. But the first thing that's done is worry about the workers and their families. How are the workers and how are the families? And getting the families in good shape before you expect the workers to come in. And of course, working on the facility itself. So that's kind of some lessons to be learned here, is that you have to do these kinds of things. Now, how do you do these kinds of things? I think Eric mentioned business continuity team, and this is one thing that Yossi also talks about a lot. You have to have a team in place. That doesn't mean they're working every day, but when a major disruption that team has to be energized to come together and basically, figure out what's going to get done. First thing to do is quarantine them, worry about the employees, reconfigure all the plans around the fact that those locations are not going to be there. And those are specified people in the company. They are taken off their job and put on this continuity team. It's what's called crisis control, and Yossi talks a bit about that as well in his book. So I think that's the key. The key is what happens in this environment, and the reason why Yossi calls this competitive advantage is that most companies look at this as this is an insurance issue. I'm just going to buy insurance on my facilities, right? Well, that doesn't take into account that you lost business. And so you basically want to get back into normal operations as soon as possible to minimize that revenue and profitability loss, because insurance doesn't cover it. And that company that is actually able to get back from one of these major disruptions gets competitive advantage over its competitors. And that's why he calls it that you just want to minimize that amount of time to get operations back and running, and also keep the operations going as long as that facility is out of the network, right?
Okay. Now we're talking a lot about like disaster response type teams that are put together, and I want to keep on that a little bit as far as our response. I know we need to build the mitigation plans going forward, but Mike, as far as when the events occur, what are your initial reactions? Do you guys put together, are you replanning at that point? Are you kicking in some plans that you've done before? Is it as kind of a disaster recovery? How do you look at these after events occurs?
But if you wait until the event occurs, you're probably too late. as Pat and Larry both have been saying, there's got to be contingency plans put in place, and this has been most successful whenever there's been look at what's the entire depth of the supply chain, what is going to be impacted by different areas, and what will we do when those are impacted. If you look at it more like it's not an if, it's a when. Something's going to happen. So get ready and know what the backups are. Like Larry was saying, the isolation, the immediate response, get the help to the families. Absolutely, that's critical. And then for the mobilization, there needs to already be the core of a plan there that says expect the demand to look like this. And that can't just be, here's the consumer goods that are going to immediately go into place, or the sheetrock and plywood and stuff like that. When I was at Bayer, there was a plant right in the middle of all that storm, and they made a key component that went into plywood and had to go into a force majeure as a result of that. But the response then also came back to say, but now we need a lot more of that commodity, so we need to figure out a way to respond to that. And there had to be some global implications to engage the entire global supply chain to respond and get the supplies to the right component makers, so that then they could replenish what was consumed in a very quick time. So anticipating that is probably the most important part. And which gets back to the demand planning piece. So it's not just, this is what my demand is expected to be, this is what it could go to under different scenarios. And then anticipate, okay, the consumer's going to need this, those are going to have to be the priorities. If we can't do it all, pick these first. That's really important. That helps that disaster recovery or the contingency team know, okay, here's the decisions they have to make, because they don't have time to do the analysis, they just have to respond.
Okay. Mike, this is Pat. Did you find that you had a lot of products that were sole sourced, and did you have feedstocks that were feeding your operations coming out of Katrina that otherwise impacted your ability to produce?
Yes, that definitely happened, and I've seen that a couple of times where you get into a lull in the emergency. Katrina was the first major hurricane in quite a while. Now we're seeing it again. The tsunami in Japan hit people and caught a lot of people that use semiconductors by surprise. And it's easy to get caught in the trap of, I got a really good procurement deal, got a really good supply arrangement, this sole source, I can save a lot of money. There needs to be looking at, okay, every 5, 10, 15 years, this thing is going to happen. Is that contract really worth that much money under those conditions? Will we lose too much competitive advantage, and that cost us too much? So therefore, that particular contract with the sole source isn't as beneficial as we think it is. That was some soul searching that had to go on after those events.
Okay. Patrick brought up a good point. He was talking about data, and that's why I want to actually go to you, Andrew. You're a whiz with big data and analytics, and I want to talk to you about, as far as during these disasters, the importance of data. How do you get it? What do you need? So, Andrew, are you there?
Yes, I am. Absolutely. Can you hear me, Eric?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. No, great points all made so far, and there's a lot of leadership level perspectives represented on this call. I think just briefly trying to take it back with that big data and how do I apply this in the world of analytics that I do as an actual demand planner. I think a lot of it comes down to different types of things that you would do with data in terms of prepare, react, and then post-mortem. So in the most basic react, right? If you're a demand planner and you get pulled into these tiger teams and these crisis teams, really a lot of what's going to be done is kind of bottoms up planning, but with a higher frequency and higher level of detail than you might be doing when business is in normal phases with things like monthly S&OP. What that could mean is getting into a lot more, if you're doing, for example, country SKU level planning, right? You might be getting down with your sales ops teams or even yourself not only tracking monthly or weekly, but daily and sometimes even hourly, what is happening at the account level, what is happening at the consumer level, your major retailers, and really kind of having almost a RSS feed or a stock ticker of that information going on, because a lot of what may need to transpire is whether you're in an industry that can benefit from certain disasters, and whether that's lagged demand or immediate demand, or if you might be in an altruistic industry like healthcare, right? And then it's really just all boots on the ground, which is kind of the industry I'm in now. We're not paying attention to a lot of the financial implications and things in the reactionary mode. We deal with that in prepare mode. And it's really getting down into that more frequent version of the same data you might be doing in larger S&OP. The top-down approach, which is more the preparation and then the same types of activities to help you prepare next time in the postmortem, is where you start getting into the correlation regression effects, the reachable correlation and regression. I'm not talking about crazy big data where you try to figure out how shipping containers are going to be procured by Amazon to get goods are going to affect your demand over in a gumball business. That's really out there. I'm talking about things like risk profiles, and where you can go into sources like the Economist has the EIU, the Economic Intelligence Unit, and their global forecasting service, which is free to all the professionals in our field, has a global risk index. And really tracking, especially when you're getting into a hurricane season or there's markets with high political risk going on, there's a variety of risks, right? That's a great resource to bring it up in your demand reviews, to talk about updating your playbook. Do we maybe purposely need to constrain demand based on some of these higher risk markets, even if the trending is going fine? Do we need to work with finance or FP&A and currency hedging? Oftentimes in OUS markets, post-disaster economic effects can wreak havoc on your financials based on what happens to the currency. And then if you're in those altruistic industries like healthcare, it's really updating your playbook to prepare for bad debt or longer AR in your financials in those markets where you just had to react. And those sorts of correlations can be drawn tracking the promotions and demand-driven events that you put into your demand planning software after something like this transpires. So went over a lot there, Pat, Larry, anybody feel free to jump in on any of those elements I just expressed, but that's a lot of hands-on what I'm trying to get my demand planners, especially the newer ones, to really understand when these unfortunate events happen and how, to the point made before, they're going to happen cyclically, right? 5, 10, 15 years, hurricane seasons every year. So this is a normal part of business.
Well, you mentioned this is a normal part of business. Did I hear someone?
No, I was going to just make a comment. If that's, I don't know if you want. I can wait. Just Larry.
Well, okay. Yeah, let me hit this question because you mentioned normal part of business. I just got this question in, and I think it's very relevant to what you just said. With the frequency of disruptions increasing, shouldn't we be thinking about continually staffing a control room to address and respond to risk and opportunities instead of having kind of a contingency team that comes together only after the event happens? I mean, is there becoming more of a need for a new function that really deals with this risk ongoing?
I'm not sure it's new function, Eric. I think that companies that do a fair amount of supply chain risk assessment do things like the dress rehearsals I discussed. I mean, they were really robust, and they really pointed to needs for data and needs for just coordination lists and communication methodologies. Do you equip people everywhere in every facility with satellite phones in case a cell network goes down? So being able to do the dress rehearsal and walk through a real scenario helps you find sort of the white spaces in your risk management plan. And I think that's unbelievably important as people go forward from some of these disasters that we've had lately, is filling in that white space that's out there.
So I think what you're saying is your team. Oh, go ahead, Larry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to point out, best practice here is a business continuity team. That's really what Yossi talked about. You have to have this team. Okay. Now, the frequency isn't necessarily going up of these things. What's happening is, as you go global, you're sourcing in more countries, you're selling in more countries, and you're making in more countries. So by nature of it, you could have a disaster almost every day. So, you know, maybe the frequency goes up because you're now global versus just a domestic operation. But so that's why the best practice is you got to have these people in place all the time. They don't necessarily work on business continuity stuff, management, but they have to be designated. So you know, somebody mentioned I got pulled in. And people shouldn't be pulled in. You should be known that when a disaster occurs, this team gets energized and they come together. And I actually went to a talk up in New Hampshire a couple of years ago for Lindt Chocolate. And we heard from a guy who's part of their business continuity management team about this. You know, it happened to be the time when the Avengers movie came out. And I don't know if you know, those of you who saw the movie, a group of, you know, Marvel heroes come together to counter a threat. And they said, is it like that, where you just pull people together, and then they fight this threat? So no. Everybody knows who's going to be on this team. They train, and they stay trained on how we're going to respond to things, because they got to make all the decisions in the short run. And that's going to happen more often because of the fact that we're now, more companies are now global, but also because you've got to act very quickly in order to get a competitive edge. And let me give you one more example of this. Josie talked about this one. There was a major plant, a supplier of a component in cell phones, that had a plant fire, and the whole plant that supplier went out. And he talks about two companies. One company went to the supplier and tried to work with the supplier, get them back up as quick as possible. Another company said, yeah, we'll do some of that, but you know, they found an alternative supplier and locked that supplier up, which meant that they got competitive advantage over the one that was just trying to get their own supplier up. Instead was able to, you know, fill in the demand they needed with the alternative stuff from the other supplier. So that's what he means, that we mean by competitive. You act quicker. You don't wait for the supplier to get back up. You quarantine them, and then you try to figure out another one, but you don't wait for them to get up. Anyhow, so I think the best practice here is a team in place already, even if they're not doing it yet, but they need to be in place. They have to be trained. They have to meet once in a while in case this thing happens. And I think you're right, Eric. I think it's going to happen more often, not because there's more events, but because we're now global. By the nature of that, we're going to see an event much more often.
Right.
Okay. Dive into a little bit about what we see as far as demand during and after an event like this. If we go back to Katrina, it showed a typical demand curve for these type of disasters where demand dropped off for about 3 to 4 weeks and then came back even stronger afterwards. GDP was actually flat when you look at it as an aggregate over time. I know the industry I was in at that point, I saw the same thing. We saw a major disruption when it occurred, but then as the dispensable income started coming back, channel pipeline inventory we had to fill, we had money being pumped in from either insurance or government being able to trickle down through the economy as well. We saw spending start to rebound as well. So if that's the typical demand curve, are we seeing that in your business, or how do you plan for that in your business? So either Andrew or Patrick, you want to jump on this one and talk a little bit about some things you saw. Kind of your two completely different industries.
Yep.
Well, I think we saw during Harvey, I think we're stepping on each other. During Harvey, we saw a decline in demand for like our hair coloring product. People that are bailing out of a hurricane are not really caring all that much about coloring the hair. And so we saw an obvious dip in all the DCs that we were shipping to for Walmart, as an example. And a couple weeks later, we saw a recovery, and we actually were able to use something like Retail Link to isolate the POS for all the Walmarts that were in Texas. And we're able to draw some conclusions from that about the impact. And we followed the POS afterwards and in the surrounding areas, and we saw the POS come up after a couple weeks and exceed. So that's an event. We don't forecast weekly, we forecast monthly. So in monthly buckets. So we were able to, we'll just roll that all into the same month something kind of is like offsetting penalties a bit. But we now have that event marked in all of our demand planning tools, so that we know next year what happened in that time frame, and so we have an explainable next year. I tend not to move that history or change that history. I don't. That was
going to be my next question. Do you change your history?
No, I don't go back and correct history. I think that's more of a preference versus a best practice, whether you want to alter the history or not. But I think you have to find some way to mark that event and mark it so that event is not statistical in the future.
Andrew, are you changing history?
I couldn't agree more with what Pat just said. I mean, if you break it down into the most simple level, trend, and seasonality, right? In my opinion, when you start thinking with these sorts of things in terms of exclusions from your history versus just notations, right? And a lot of event tracking, which we're very blessed in 2017 to have a lot of software that has a lot of those capabilities beyond just pulling stuff out of history. You start pulling stuff out, and when you have events like hurricanes that happen every year, every couple of years, you know, you've got a model that's running 36 or 72 months of demand, and all of a sudden you've lowered the level of your go-forward forecast because you're telling it these things aren't going to happen. Where it is beneficial is helping your seasonal index, right? Kind of like Easter, it doesn't hit at the same time every year, right? Same thing with flu season or any of these sort of macro events that are tied to either weather or flu season, that type of stuff. My perspective on how we kind of deal with this in Medtronic relates to the old constrained versus unconstrained argument. And even our esteemed colleague, Todd Gallant, who couldn't make it today, sent in some commentary, right? In his world, in his business, they more often than not just let the firm plan run, right? And leave the demand plan where it is and let things actualize. With the dynamic nature of healthcare and us needing to figure out how quickly our demand is changing related to these events. And we don't have, I mean, I'm sure you guys have noticed this, everybody's a healthcare consumer, right? Healthcare is not the best at POS management, right? There's no little guy in the background in the OR that's keeping track and on a little tally sheet of everything being consumed, right? What happens is we get a much bigger bullwhip signal of where things get consumed and let out to zero in an emergency. And then we've got to go back through our distribution networks to replenish that inventory. So a lot of what we do is, as we're quickly, I talked about that daily tracking and us getting engaged CPFR with our downstream distribution and key hospital accounts in affected markets, is we actually will tweak things like forecast consumption levers within our DRP systems to be able to say, we're going to open this up from weekly to monthly to quarterly to hold on to unconsumed things. Because that point, Eric, of what may seem like an immediate jump or an immediate dip in the span of 6 or 12 months might have been flat. It's just a time phasing implication. The other thing is time phase safety stocks. The demand planners have a huge influence on, even if they're not buffering via the forecast, they can have a dramatic effect on ranking where the expected risk, right, the tolerance bars of the forecast are going to increase. And that can really help the supply planning colleagues to figure out how quickly they need to react by time phasing a safety stock up.
Okay. With the same point, we talked a lot about the lost demand and that demand coming back. And there's multiple reasons why you may lose demand as well. I know summer selling season, with the impact of Harvey when it happened, we pretty much lost anything that had a summer selling season. We lost that final week going into Labor Day. The apparel business relies a lot on tourists. And when you have these type of events, you lose tourists because they're not coming in and buying apparel and taking it back. But there's the other side. It's got a question talking about things that actually spike. We talked a little bit about Home Depot and Walmart and what they did, but you have certain spikes that occur during these events as well. How do you plan for those? And bringing in another question, is there a probability of these events occurring that you're adding on? How are we going to plan the upside for these events that could be catastrophic and end up driving these different demand patterns? How are we planning for these? Help me out here. Mike, let's go to you.
Okay. I think it depends on the footprint of your business, but if it's pretty wide, don't try to look at probability of event happening in a particular place, but do look at a probability it's going to happen someplace. And that's very likely. As Larry was saying before, I've had the same experience managing a global supply chain, coordinating between all the regions. There was never a moment when we weren't responding to something going on from someplace around the globe. And in this particular case, we were providing batteries. And to answer your other question around spikes, yes, car batteries can spike. It depends. If it's a flood, it's going to spike because those batteries are going to go dead. They won't start the car later. And there's going to be some people trying to get those cars back on the market. You may not necessarily want them, but they're going to try to get them back into the market. They may need a battery. Typically, those are the low-end batteries, the less expensive kind. The other thing is the follow-on demand. So, the understanding that if there's lots of damage to property, construction materials are going to come. The follow-on demand for the second and third tier suppliers into those industries is something that we saw over and over, will spike. And so expect it to happen. So the higher the damage is, the more that spike will come, and the rest of the country still wants the rest of their commodities, and they don't particularly want to pay the higher prices that would naturally come out of that. So the more that you can respond and plan for, this is going to happen someplace. Get our setup ready so that we know how we'll respond to that spike in demand, and we can meet a certain percentage of it, not all of it. People, typically consumers will be okay with, I got to wait a little bit longer, but they're not okay with, I got to wait a whole long time in order to get my house repaired. Of course, that's not helpful to them.
Eric,
Larry.
on that note, there is a whole area of forecasting called sporadic forecasting, right? In dealing with sporadic demand. Now, it is for demand that routinely happens, but if we're doing weekly, monthly forecasting, it doesn't happen every week, or it doesn't happen every month. It could happen once a year, right? And the key lesson to get from sporadic forecasting is you got to look at least two things. Traditional forecasting looks at an average for the month or an average for the week. Well, that doesn't happen. So somebody mentioned probability. You need two things. One is the probability that events will occur this week or month or whatever year. And then the second thing is some probability distribution of what the demand is when that event occurs. And that is what the lessons we learn in sporadic forecasting. Now, the key thing of doing it that way, it's all about inventory planning and deployment. Deploying the materials you need for when that spike occurs, if you're going to do that, but understanding the fact that that's the way to model it in terms of a probability of happening and then a probability distribution of whether what the distribution of demand will be when it happens, right? And we learned this I learned this from service parts planning, because you got a lot of parts that don't get demand every year, right? So you do, and there's a Kruston's method, and you use that, and it's all about inventory, really. It's not about forecasting.
How do we get the probabilities of these events occurring? I mean, are you forecasting the weather, or how would you recommend we get the probability of events?
Okay, I can recommend a book. Nate Silver wrote a great book called The Signal and the Noise, where he goes over several years ago, right? Every forecaster, every demand planner should read that book. I actually did a whole column on this. But basically, Nate goes through and he talks about every different industry, many different industries, include earthquakes and the weather, and how they handle forecasting. And so you ought to read that and see what he has to say, because he went around and talked to people who do earthquake forecasting and weather forecasting and all that other stuff, and how they do it. So it's a very interesting. I found it to be one of the best books I've ever read, at least from a business perspective.
I think Larry brings up some really good points, as well as Mike. I'm not sure that it's all about demand planning, because to their points, it's probably going to happen somewhere within the consumer good industry. I think a lot of it gets back into supply, and this is where you start lining up goals within S&OP. And listen, it's summer season, it's hurricane season. Maybe we build some extra plywood inventory or build extra stock of water so we can immediately deploy it. Or if you feel like your supply is vulnerable, build extra raw material or component supply, or build extra finished goods in advance of the hurricane season. I mean, there's people that have producing facilities in hurricane zones. You have to sort of manage the probability of having an outage at some point in time if you have a producing facility in a hurricane zone. I think in your article, Eric, that was sort of preceded the webinar, you talked about some of the polypropylene, polyethylene production that sort of got wiped out with Harvey. And I have to tell you, the first heart palpitation that I had post Harvey was, am I going to have enough? Will there be enough resin to make the plastic bottles that go into our product? And we don't typically ask those type of questions, and I thought it's going to give me cause to pause as I start planning for components next hurricane season, because I'm probably going to heavy up on them, which will alter the seasonality of the entire business. So it's kind of weird.
Yeah, and I think that's what Mike's point was, at the upstream components you talked about, Mike, on that.
Yeah,
so
that's a key factor. That's right. No, that's okay. I was just going to say, you're right. That's a key factor.
Okay. We have time for a couple more questions. First of all, the book, Larry, you mentioned Nate's book. Do you want to repeat that? Because I have quite a few people asking for that book, so they can be able to get it themselves.
Yeah, it's called Nate Silver, real simple, it's like the metal, right, is the author. And Nate actually is known in political forecasting as well as sports forecasting. But he went around, did a lot of research in this, and this thing is called Signal in the Noise.
Signal in the Noise by Nate.
Right.
By Nate Silver.
This is seminal work in the industry. It's something that every demand planner should read.
Exactly. I agree. And I said we had a lot of people asking for that, so I wanted to make sure they actually got what it was so they could go find that book. So in the last couple minutes here, I want to hit on, so Patrick and Andrew, this question's for you. As far as the role of the demand planner, we talked a lot about S&OP, risk management, and kind of the planning ahead of time for this. What do you feel the role of the forecaster and demand planner in that process is? And so what do they need to interject themselves, and what do they need to make sure they're doing? So, Andrew.
Sure thing. I think one really important thing that Pat hit on in the broader context of S&OP, and I know a lot of people want to get probabilities and how a waterfall is, and Larry, thank you for the resource, and everyone should read it. But the other thing to remember is that really, if there's a silver lining to disruptive events, it's that it gives demand planners a really unique chance to spread their wings a little bit into regression and causal analytics. I mean, most everybody spends their time on time series everything. And as you really start to post-mortem, I think one of the most valuable services a demand planner can provide is on those descriptive analytics against those past events, really building out those internal probabilities, right? What were your statistical results telling you on how correlated these events were to your changes in demand, to the changes in your time phasing of your demand, right? The periodicity of it. So I think that can't be stressed enough. I think demand planners should spend almost as much time, and I really, really assert this when I talk about talent management within S&OP. I really think the analysts and early generation planners should spend a lot of their first few years doing historical cleansing and event correlations and really understanding, Pat talked about that profile of their consumer, that profile of their demand, and then that lends them to give those recommendations into the playbooks, to put out a marketing 4Ps survey before every demand review to talk about what's happening, not only in opportunities, right, but we talk about R&O, so that risk section, right? And you can bring information from the Economist global risk results. You can bring your past correlations that might come up again in the S&OP horizons you're talking about. I think that it boils down to being someone that asks more questions. Supply planning is going to be reactionary. Demand planning can be a bit more of a tactician with it.
Patrick, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think maybe it's more of a summarization. I think the demand planning organization becomes the keeper of the demand curve. So everything that's happened historically is noted and managed as events. And when we plan in the future, they could speak to what caused the demand curve to wobble in one way or the other. And frankly, those extrinsic external factors that influence the demand curve that are unusual to the demand curve become a real important part of the planning process. It's almost like how you plan a promotion that's happened historically. You always want to make sure you do that notation, call it out, and understand the reaction that happened with it. And the other thing about the demand curves, about the demand planning organization, is most demand planners have some really keen insight to what's happening inside of a customer, because if they're doing sort of deep dive analytics prepping for a consensus meeting, they understand who the customers are, what they buy, and how they buy. And they've already done a whole bunch of data mining. So frankly, during events in the past, I draw upon my demand planners in sort of reactionary mode to be my data miners of all demand information. And because they've already done that work, they already have a whole bunch of models set up in advance to be able to tell me what Walmart DCs are in the Texas area, and be able to isolate that demand so I can understand what the potential impact might be for an event like Harvey, as an example. So as keepers of the demand curve, they provide an awful lot of insight in advance as you're planning and trying to manage next year, and in a very reactive mode.
Okay. Yeah, Patrick, Eric, one more thing. What's the metric here? And that's what I want to talk about. What's the metric of responding, right? The metric of responding is, and Yossi again talks about this in his book, is how quickly do you come back from an event like this happening in your supply chain? And that's measured in terms of when you get your revenue back to where levels that you had before. And you want to do that as quickly as possible, because that's what being competitive is about, is yeah, it happened, but let's get back, let's do what we have to do to get back. Now, the forecaster in that is demand planner in that is crucial. They got it because lots of decisions could get made. Every decision that gets made needs to have a forecast associated with it in terms of what revenue we want to get back. So we can work on the things to get the most revenue back first, and then the other revenues second, third, and fourth. So frankly, if I was still working, I'd love to be involved in one of these things, work in real time to do real time forecasting, right?
It's funny, Larry, you bring that up, because I think prioritization of what customers you're going to serve, what products you're going to make, depending on how it impacted you. If it impacted a producing facility, you really want to have your priorities aligned. And again, the demand planning department has an awful lot of insight into the flow of demand, and they can provide you with some sort of intelligence as, what has the greatest market share, what items, ABC ranking of items, so what items are the most critical to serve, what items are flanker items that are supporting items but not necessarily core items, because they've already broken that data down 100 times to tomorrow. So demand planning has a big part in the response for sure, and a lot of it's providing the data that I've talked about probably too many times this morning.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, I think we're about out of time. I'm getting a lot of great questions I can't answer because due to time constraints, but I do want to make sure that you guys have some of this information. So we have some upcoming conferences, and I want to thank the panel first of all. It was a fantastic job. I think you had some great input. There's a lot of good information given. So thank you, Andrew, Larry, Mike, and Pat. It was very enjoyable, and I think the audience got a lot out of this as well. If you want to stay part of this, there's a couple things you can do. First of all, we talked a lot about the impact to these regions. One of the impacts that one of the regions impacted was Orlando, Florida. If you want to support the people in Florida, one of the best way to do it is to start spending money down there. And we have an opportunity for you. There's an upcoming conference in Orlando. It's the Business Planning and Forecasting Conference. This is actually our flagship event every year. It's October 24th to 27th. I know Andrew and Patrick's going to be there. Mike, are you going to be there as well?
I don't have plans at this time.
Okay, so I know Patrick and Andrew and myself will be there.
And Larry.
And Larry, of course Larry will be there. And this is a great opportunity. If you have these questions, find us there, talk about it. That's one of the great things about this conference is networking. We're actually going to keep the early bird pricing open for another week. And if you mention this conference, you can actually get another $100 off. So we got a great deal for you. It's a great conference. I highly recommend everybody take advantage of it. You can hear from everyone on the panel, enjoy the largest gathering of global professionals in the industry in S&OP, IBP, demand planning, and forecasting and analytics. So I said it's an amazing networking opportunity as well. For the international friends, I'm actually going to be in Amsterdam next week, but IBF is actually going to be hosting a conference in November in the Netherlands. It's the 15th through the 17th of November at the Doubletree by Hilton. It's right in the heart of Amsterdam, so it's a good location. It's a great conference for Europe friends. So if you want anybody over there wants to be able to attend these type of conferences, November 15th to the 17th of November, we got a great conference in Amsterdam. You can find out both of those at ibf.org, and you can find out other great information about becoming more involved and being part of this process for forecasting and demand planning going forward. And finally, we need to hear back from you. I love to hear what you thought of this conference, hear some reviews. Let us know what you want to see here in the future. We're actually going to be sending out a survey right after this to everybody that participated. We need your feedback. That's the way we can continue to grow. That's the way we need to understand where what we're doing right and what we need to do better. So please share your thoughts, ideas, etc. Also included in that's going to be another survey that's asking for your opinion on the future of forecasting and demand planning. You can see it going around social media right now. There's a new survey from the IBF. It's a simple 4-question survey talking about what forecasting, demand planning, S&OP analytics is going to look like in the year 2025. We need your feedback to understand exactly directionally what you think is going to be happening. What's the disruptive type of technologies or core competence that people will need going forward? We're going to compile that, and anybody comes to the Orlando conference, you can actually be able to see a preview, an executive summary of that data. We'll have the data done by that. We're finishing up by the end of this month. So we'll be able to then provide a feedback to you as the membership of, hey, this is what the industry and field is seeing. So if you complete that summary results, we'll be happy to send you or provide you the results afterwards if you provide us the feedback first of all. So with that, I think our time has expired. I really enjoyed this. I look forward to the next panel coming up in the months to come. So with that, thank you all very much and look forward to seeing you in Orlando or the Netherlands. Thank you. Goodbye.